Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, November 18th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, now that the shutdown is over, contracting officers have a lot to catch up on. Plus, what keeps recreational boaters safe, and what happens if the funding dries up? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Last week's conclusion of the record-breaking government shutdown was great news for federal employees in general, but for a few thousand feds, it was even better news. They'd been told they were about to lose their jobs completely, and those positions are now safe. That's thanks to a provision of the legislation that undid reductions in force that happened during the shutdown. Recent court documents shed more light on exactly how many employees the Trump administration tried to fire during that time frame. Federal News Network's Jared Serbu is here with more details on what we learned from those tallies. Jared, thanks for joining me.
You bet.
This was all part of a lawsuit that unions were using to try to reverse those rifts while the shutdown was going on. What did the documents tell us?
Well, this is sort of a compilation that we put together of various declarations that have come from agency by agency filings over the past month or so. And the grand total, it looks like, is 3,605 people that got RIF notices from various agencies since the beginning of the shutdown, October 1st. And according to the law Congress passed ending the shutdown, theoretically, stronger than theoretically, almost certainly all of those will be reversed. And that 3,605 number may not be a complete tally. It is what agencies have reported to the court are covered by the litigation. And to be covered by the litigation, you needed to have been working in a program, project, or activity that was represented or that had at least one employee that was represented by one of the union plaintiffs in this case. And by the end of the case, that was really all federal unions. So that should be a pretty solid number, that 3,605. But they were consolidated in a relative handful of agencies. The biggest by far of agencies that did RIFs during the shutdown was the IRS, 1,399, followed by HHS, 982, Education, 465, and the Department of Commerce, 263. There was a very small number in the Department of Homeland Security also. Those were all within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, though, just 54 in all of DHS, and that gets you to that 3,605 total.
Now, this doesn't apply to any RIFs that happened prior to the shutdown, correct?
It does not explicitly, as far as the legislation that reopened the government, it doesn't apply to anything that happened prior to the shutdown. And that's actually a really important point because one of the pieces that kept coming up during the course of this litigation was, around the question of, is it legal to fire feds because there is a shutdown or during a shutdown? You get the question of, okay, well, were some of these in process and they just happened to occur during the shutdown because that's the natural pace at which they unfolded, or were they really because of the shutdown? Congress really mooted that issue with this legislation by saying, we don't really care what the reasons were. If there was any action that any executive agency took between October 1st and the passage of the continuing resolution last week, those now have no force or effect. So the reasons now don't matter. As long as they happened prior to the shutdown, the RIFs don't count.
Well, that's a great way of clearing the tables then. What's the status of the lawsuit now that Congress has undone all those RIFs?
Well, based on everything we just talked about, we would sort of assume that most of that lawsuit is moot, or all of that lawsuit is moot, because the main issue they were fighting for has now been resolved by Congress. We don't know that with 100% certainty yet. The government has asked that the court find that the union plaintiffs' claims are moot at this point, but that has not happened. They are going to go meet, and the government is going to go meet and confer with the federal unions to see if they think that there is anything left that needs to be litigated over. But as we just talked about a second ago, the law itself does tell us some pretty specific things. Again, that the reasons for the RIFs don't matter. If it happened after October 1st, then the RIF doesn't count. And also, any employee that got that notice needs to be notified and reinstated within 5 days. Now, of course, depending on whether that's interpreted as business days versus calendar days, employees will have already gotten that, or they could get it this week, but it should be coming really at any time this month. But another thing that the law tells us is agencies really can't just turn around and reissue these RIF notices tomorrow, because the appropriations language that's in the law says that none of the funding that's appropriated by this continuing resolution can be used for those RIFs. So it's not a situation where it looks like agencies are going to be able to rescind those RIFs and then just reissue them again with a fully open government.
That's good to hear. And this isn't the only court case that was challenging RIFs. Where do we stand with the other litigation that's challenging the Trump administration's reductions in force or other sorts of personnel actions?
Yeah, assuming this one goes away entirely, which we think is going to be the case, the main one that's still out there around reductions in force has been kind of floating around the court systems for several months now, and that's the lawsuit, also by federal unions, challenging agencies' reorganization and reduction in force plans. That is still in a little bit of limbo, mainly with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Just to take you back a minute and refresh everybody's memory, because there have been so many court cases on this, what happened at the highest levels of the judicial system here was that the Supreme Court determined that the president likely had the legal authority to issue an order, basically restructuring the government broadly and ordering reductions in force. But the court explicitly said it was not making any judgments on the individual agency by agency RIF and reorganization plans. So that's where we are right now. What the Ninth Circuit has taken up most recently is whether those individual plans need to be turned over to the union plaintiffs and to the judge to review privately, so that there can start to be some sort of assessment of those plans' legality on a one-by-one basis. That was partly decided by the Ninth Circuit at a 3-judge panel level, and they determined that, yes, those can be made available to the judge. The government has now gone back to the full Ninth Circuit and asked for a rehearing of that decision, so may not even be the final word on that. So basically where we are on that is, after a couple months, we are still arguing over whether federal agencies need to make their reorganization and RIF plans public. So it's hard to even come to any sort of it's hard for anybody, including the judges or the lawyers, to come to a full assessment of whether or not those plans were legal. It is unusual, in my experience, for any federal agency to do large-scale layoffs or reorganizations without sharing any of the details with anyone, but that is where we are with basically all of them. The government is continuing to argue that those plans are shielded by deliberative process privilege and that they are pre-decisional, even though in many cases the RIFs have already occurred.
Well, Jared, since you said that the startup legislation from Congress takes all the reasons off the table and reinstates all of those RIFs, is someone cross-checking to make sure that these older reorganization plans and their RIF strategies aren't reconstructed again?
None of the union lawyers have told me this, but I can almost guarantee you that they are doing that right now to make sure that there's no, significant cross-pollination between those two sort of buckets of cases. But one thing we do know is there was a pretty limited universe of things that could have crossed over. One of them was in the Department of the Interior, who started down the road of issuing some RIF notices that they said had been in the planning stages for many months, but then just kind of stopped that planning process once the litigation started. This gets a little decomplicated by the fact that when you look at an agency by agency perspective, there really weren't that many during the shutdown. There were agencies that did a lot of them, again, the IRS being the biggest, but you really only had a half a dozen agencies that issued RIF notices in the first place. So those are going to be pretty easy to analyze and take apart and see if there was anything untoward happening. But it doesn't look like there are any indications of any kind of mixing between those two buckets as far as we can tell.
That's Federal News Network's Jared Serbu. Jared, thanks for breaking this all down for us.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, what keeps recreational boaters safe and what happens when the funding dries up? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The nation's waterways may have some more reckless driving on them. Among the Trump administration's cuts to government spending, the Coast Guard planned to cut funding for boating safety grants to states and nonprofits. To find out what this could mean for the maritime community and to get a little more insight into how they work, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with David Kennedy, Government Affairs Manager for the boat insurance company Boat US.
Mr. Kennedy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eric, for having me.
Great. So how does this Coast Guard recreational boating safety grant work, or how do these grants work? How much are we talking about here, and where does the money necessarily go to?
Sure. So what we're initially talking about here are the Coast Guard nonprofit recreational boat grants, which I am happy to report have been renewed for 2025, which was one of the things that was in question, but have those going forward. And these go out to several different groups, and I'll say including the Boat US Foundation for Clean Water and Safe Boating. But it's used for a variety of issues. One of the groups is the National Association of Boating Law Administrators. And these are the state level folks who really deal with recreational boats in their states and their safety programs. So it trains law enforcement, local law enforcement in the operation of boats, helps coordinate, gives us uniform laws. Another group supported by it is the American Boat and Yacht Council, which is really the standard-setting body for the design of recreational boats, making sure we have safe recreational boats. So overall, this program is supported through something called the Sportfish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund. This is a program that takes the taxes paid by boaters through motor fuel tax, tax on fishing equipment, about 6 different sources of funds, that then goes back out to boating safety and boating access and environmental programs. So it's a longstanding program that we have a lot of support for. The nonprofit grants are about $6.5 million a year. The overall trust fund is in the neighborhood of $650 million to $700 million a fiscal year.
Gotcha. Okay. And so from that fund, there is also some federal funding that comes into play here, and those go to fund boating safety programs and the like. Do I have that correctly, or what is the government participation in this?
Sure. So, like I say, it's talking about the Sportfish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund that takes in boaters' taxes and anglers, I should say recreational anglers. So every time you buy a fishing pole, there's a tax on that. And those funds come into the federal government, and they're then dispersed back out to programs that benefit the end user. So we call it a user pay, user benefit program. The nonprofit grants are one example. It also funds Coast Guard's program to the states for their boating safety programs. So you go to Virginia or Maryland, they have their state DNR or different. Every state does it a little bit differently. Provides a level of their funding well. And that also is matched by boat registration fees and other fishing licenses, so that it's a real compounding effect. We call it a cycle of success that really supports the overall system that then our members go out and enjoy.
We're speaking with David Kennedy, the manager of government affairs at Boat US. All right, so then the idea came about, hey, let's stop all that. Let's cut that bit of funding out, reallocate resources, whatever they had planned for. What was the controversy at stake?
I think the question was folks not really understanding what the program was and what it did. And so that's where roles for association like Boat US come in. And we were able to have a dialogue with the administration, with the folks in Congress who support us. We have great support from the House Transportation Committee Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, from Senator Cruz and Senator Cantwell, and just to bring them up to speed on what this program means and how it is able to go out and support. And as I said, we're able to happily report that it has in fact been funded for 2025. And now, certainly incumbent on us to continue to make sure folks understand that why this is important and how it goes back into the programs that the boaters and the anglers all support. So,
not to have to rehash old turf, but what was in your pitch in those conversations with the government officials on the effect that these grants have on boating safety and any other restoration efforts?
I think for a number of the nonprofits that get this group, this is a decent part of their funding, and they were going to have to make some hard choices about which programs they were able to support, which they could do going forward. So I think it was helping them to understand what these programs did. And I'll go back to the example of the boating law administrators, where they really provide a link between Coast Guard and the states and the state on water law enforcement. So I think that was a piece of it. Understanding the standard setting piece of it and how that really makes the whole process of getting safety design updates out there into the system. And at this point, the U.S. standards are the world standards. Everybody looks to the United States and to ABYC for how they're going to safely design a boat. And we wanted to make sure folks understood that keeping that piece running was important. So those were some of the things we touched on. And then we do things like our program. We have a life jacket loaner program. So, you're going to take the grandkids out and you don't have a child-sized life jacket, well, you can come to Boat US and borrow one. So there's programs like that as well that are just real simple, good safety, and make it so people can go out and have fun and be safe on the water.
Can you give us a snapshot of the effect that programs like this have on boating safety and where we stand as a country when it comes to boating safety? Growing up here in Maryland, I still see that the waterways are as crowded as ever. But as we know, more participation means more potential situations for trouble. Where do things currently stand?
That's the good news. We've gotten to be, it's a very safe activity. And like anything, you have to be cautious and think about the risks. But overall, last year in 2024, we had the lowest number of fatalities that we've had since they started keeping records. In 1971, they passed the Recreational Boating Safety Act. I'm not sure I have the title quite right on that, but the estimate is that we've sort of prevented over 100,000 deaths since that passed. So I think all of these programs are going to improve boating safety. And so, but we've got to continue that work. And that was one of the things that we emphasized when we were discussing this program and continue to do that safety. I mean, you speak about Maryland. Maryland was actually the first state that put in a requirement for on-water education, or for boater education, I should say. And since then, that concept has really spread across the nation. And in fact, Boat US's own foundation, we're the largest provider of free online boating education. So people can come to boatus.org and they can get their boater education certification, and or it tells that you've gone through it. And again, that's how we're keeping boating safe and trying to improve that. So those are the kinds of things that this all supports.
On that theme of continuance, you had mentioned that you're all set for 2025 after having to do a little bit of lobbying on your part. What does things look like going forward? Do you think that you'll be able to maintain that level of communication with the powers that be, whether or not any different personnel may be involved?
Sure. I mean, I believe so, but that's my job to believe such things. And again, we've got a great working relationship with the Coast Guard and with the Department of Homeland Security. I always will point out to folks, when people are 18 years old and deciding to go to the Coast Guard Academy for their career, they did it because they wanted to help people. And so that's why it's such a great agency to work with. And so I think the trust fund is up for reauthorization in the coming year. It's done about every 5 years. We've certainly have the legislation has been introduced. It's bipartisan. This is one of these issues that is supported by everyone out there. They understand how it works. And there's a really good community of interest groups like ourselves that work with and make sure that folks understand that this works. So I remain optimistic. It really is a system that feeds itself. I think you get to boaters and anglers, they understand that we've got the most interest in protecting the resource and we've got to contribute to it. So I feel like we'll be okay, but we can have to continue to tell the story and let folks know why it's important.
I think all it would take is just one sunset cruise to turn anybody around on the issue if they just disagree, right?
Yep.
David Kennedy is the manager of government affairs for Boat US. Thank you so much for filling us in.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate the opportunity. And hopefully if folks have boats, they'll become Boat US members.
And you can find more information about this and this interview on our website. Go to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. You can also subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
Still to come, can digital engineering cut a decade-long test program in half? But first, now that the shutdown is over, contracting officers have a lot to catch up on. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Contracting officers and contractors alike are facing a mosaic of updates, everything from FAR deviations to new DoD priorities like speed and portfolio-based acquisition. Emily Murphy, Senior Fellow at the Baroni Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University, is here with advice on how 1102s and businesses can keep it all straight while dealing with increasing workloads. Emily, great to have you here this morning.
It's wonderful to be with you again, Terry.
A lot has happened over the last few weeks, and as people in the contracting world get back to their desks and start things back up again, they've got a lot to touch base on. Just before the shutdown, we had the publishing of the FAR overhaul, and Defense has come out with a lot of new priorities. How can people start to put all these pieces together and make sure they're working with the whole picture?
It's a really complicated picture right now. And I want to go back and say, like, GSA, DoD, NASA, OFPP did an incredible job in getting that FAR overhaul done and published. And they even got the updated FAR companion out during the shutdown, which I know has to have been a struggle. So they did a wonderful job with it. USDA, Department of Homeland Security, and GSA have all adopted the entire new set of standard deviations. That means, however, that no other agency has. So if you're a contracting officer right now, or you're a contractor, there's not a standard set of rules you can go to. You have to be looking at which deviations did this agency adopt? How does that interface with what contract vehicle I'm using? And what about this other policy that's happening over at Department of War? There's not a clear one-size-fits-all answer to the problem anymore. If you think GSA, for example, assisted acquisition has always said that they follow the rules of the funding agency. So if money and requirements coming into GSA's assisted acquisition service, they're going to follow that agency's money and the rules that come with it. Well, that might mean that they're adopting, if it's coming in from Department of Energy, one set of rules, Department of War, another set of rules. If it's coming in from the SBA, it might be a third set of rules. So I keep thinking that if I'm an 1102 right now, a contracting officer, I want more monitors, because I'm going to have so many different versions of rules and guidance up until we can make it through this. Until that standardization, I think the standardization is going to come, but I think it's going to be a really tough few months as the new rulemaking takes effect, as more and more agencies adopt those standard deviations, and as we get more clarity on what the Department of War's new announcement from the 7th of December actually means in the application, so that we know what to expect with those contracts.
How much more complicated does the continuing resolution make it? Because now some agencies have full year appropriations. We have a CR in place for others through the 30th of January. And on top of that, we have all these new rules that you're talking about.
So if one thing contracting officers are used to dealing with, and contractors are very used to dealing with, it's CRs. I don't think that that's going to be the hard thing. It does slow down new starts for the agencies that have a continuing resolution. For the agencies that actually have their appropriations, it means that they can get started. It actually may help balance the workload out a little bit, because you can start the new starts for agencies that have the authority while you're still working on the continuing resolution, and continuing the existing contracts for all the other agencies. But the sort of mosaic of rules and regulations out there is going to make things tougher as they're trying. It's one more complication to throw into the mix. And the irony is that this is all really intended to make things simpler, faster, cheaper, better. And I think ultimately it will, but it's going to be a little bit painful for the next couple months.
Well, speaking of simpler, faster, better, cheaper, what's the perspective of contractors? We're talking first about the contracting workforce, but contractors and especially small business organizations who might not have a big contracting shop to help them navigate all of this, what should they be looking at and thinking about in this new sort of interim period?
So they need to be really carefully looking at not just their contracts, but the agencies they're doing business with and seeing where the changes are coming. For example, if you're an 8A firm, you need to be looking at the new competition rules that are in Part 19. If you're a service-disabled veteran or a woman-owned small business or hub zone company, it's opening up the realm of what you can compete for, because things that were previously in the 8A program are now available if an agency chooses to take them and compete them amongst those other socioeconomic categories. They can. But that's just looking at the small business programs. They also need to be looking at the clauses. Right now, their contracts probably have the old clause matrix in them. But Part 12, reduced for commercial type contracting, reduced the number of clauses by about 30%. Which clauses are changing? Which ones can they get, and what does that transition look like for them? What can they stop doing? And what do they have to change how they've been approaching? And it's going to be a sort of a contract by contract answer. Someone's going to deal with their flow downs. And then we're also hearing, I think Jason Miller, your colleague, reported on that there's going to be maybe some changes to how IT value-added resellers are being treated. So that's not even in the current regulations, but it's something that's sort of looming out there over the community that they're going to need to be paying a lot of attention to, because limitation on subcontracting is becoming more important. Compliance with contracting terms. Frankly, even the move towards OTAs and CSOs and all sorts of alternative contracting, they're going to have to become masters at a whole another set of contracting options, or award options, I should say, not even contracting options at that point.
I'm speaking with Emily Murphy. She's former administrator of the General Services Administration and senior fellow at the Baroni Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. Emily, along with all of these changes, you've been a strong advocate for training of 1102s. But with all of this happening, and we have Secretary Hegseth announcing a complete shift in focus for DAU, now the Warfighting Acquisition University, what do you see as key to keeping 1102s current and keeping their mindset focused on these new ways of doing business?
So we're giving the 1102s, the contracting community, a lot of new tools. I mean, you're seeing GSAI, the Department of War is rolling out new tools as well. Everyone's got new tools. We've got new regulations. We've got new authorities. What I haven't seen is anyone budgeting for the time to train the workforce on how to use these and how to use them properly. There are some very powerful tools out there and very powerful changes in the regulations themselves that give that workforce a lot more authority. But you've got a realignment of who your contracting officers are going to be reporting to within the Department of War, so that they're going to be reporting to, instead of up into a contracting organization, they're going to be aligned with the program instead. At least that's what's been stated. We haven't seen the reassignments happen yet. So how is that going to change day-to-day business? Who's taking the time to sit down and explain? You can now do a simplified acquisition procedures for commercial items up to $9 million. What does that look like? How do I do it? How do I do it well? If I still have to get a senior level approval for an award above, and choose your threshold because it varies from agency to agency, $100,000, $50,000, $250,000, $1 million. What advantage is there to these new simplified tools that I've got if everything's still going to go through an enhanced level of review that's imposed at the agency level? How does that play itself out? And where should I be spending my time and prioritizing to get that best deal? There's so much more data. How do I use it well? How do I make sure that it doesn't create a conflict of interest also? If I'm educating an AI model, how do I make sure I'm educating it appropriately and then using it in a way that doesn't create its own organizational conflict of interest or its own problems with inherently governmental? How do I make sure it's not hallucinating?
Who should be thinking about that training and who should be funding it, since so many of these changes are centrally driven?
So I know that GSA has been thinking about this. The Department of War, with the rebranding and renaming of the DAU to WAU, is thinking about training. The problem is time. You've got a workforce that has been under enormous pressure to get things out the door, and training isn't something that happens. They lost over 40 days. I mean, so they lost over 6 weeks of opportunity where they couldn't go and take that training. And there is a backlog of work. Training, unfortunately, gets frequently put on the back burner at that point when it needs to be prioritized first, so that you've got the ability to actually execute better on what's waiting on your desk. But that's easy to say. It's a lot harder to do when your desk is overflowing with work.
So contracting shops are a lot leaner after all the DRPs and downsizing. We've got lots of new confusing rules. Do you anticipate that this is going to pose a problem in terms of oversight and then potentially protests as this plays out?
I think it is. I think it's interesting that I heard the other day that it's about 25% of the acquisition workforce is gone. I don't know if that's I couldn't point to the source of that or the statistic on it, but that's a substantial reduction at a time when we're not seeing a reduction in contracting actions or in spending. And when you've got different rules and different interpretations of those rules and guidance that can be changed regularly that doesn't have the same effect as a actual regulation, it leaves open the possibility that contracting officers or program offices or others can be interpreting things in different ways. And a difference of interpretation is ripe for oversight. And I don't mean that in a negative way. That oversight can actually help highlight where you've got discrepancies if it's done appropriately. It can also, though, turn into a game of gotcha. And it's for a workforce that's already stretched pretty thin, playing gotcha with them just doesn't seem very fair right now.
I've been speaking with Emily Murphy. She's former administrator of the General Services Administration and a senior fellow at the Baroni Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. Emily, thank you as always for your terrific insight.
Thank you, Terry. It's great being with you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, can digital engineering cut a decade-long test program in half? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Army is racing to field a prototype assault aircraft by early 2027 that flies twice as fast and twice as far as the Black Hawk. Colonel Jeffrey Poquet and Bell's Ryan Ayinger explained to Federal News Network's Jared Serbu how 215 flight hours on the V-280 Valor demonstrator proved tilt-rotor technology works. They also talked about why maintainers with virtual toolboxes are fixing design problems before metal gets cut, and how digital twins for every aircraft will slash the 70% of lifecycle costs typically spent on sustainment. Here's their conversation.
Don't need to dig into all of the details that went into the source selection here, but if you could give me, just give our listeners a minute or two on this new platform and what makes it such a step forward from the platforms it's replacing, that would help us out greatly for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, and I could go ahead and give an industry perspective on that. And this is Ryan. So really back in the 2012-2013 timeframe, we were looking to differentiate capability for the warfighter in terms of vertical lift capability by going twice as fast and twice as far. And a lot of that was under the Future Vertical Lift program effort. And so we started with a demonstrator concept called the V-280 Valor that really captured a lot of lessons learned from previous tilt rotor experience that Bell had, and really leveraged that to fly a demonstrator in 2017, accumulate about 215 flight hours on it, and I think inform the Army on tilt rotor technology and requirements that could be met by that technology to support their eventual solicitation and down select of a tilt rotor for supporting the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft program.
Great. Anything to add on that, Colonel?
Yeah, it's very similar. The Army was looking for something that provided transformational speed and range over the current Black Hawk fleet. And then additionally, the government really wanted the aircraft to be an open system. So the ability to upgrade the aircraft in the future quickly, cheaply, without necessarily having to go to any one particular vendor. So the open system is another key part of the platform.
Got it. And so at this point, looking forward, the ask from the Secretary, as I understand it, is to get a prototype up and running by next fiscal year, which is pretty ambitious. So talk us through a bit some of the key things that you're going to be doing to meet that schedule.
Yeah, we've been laser focused on acceleration and getting a prototype out there next year. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is taking the success that we had on the V280 demonstrator, applying a lot of the items from that in terms of configuration and critical technologies, applying that to a design, meeting the requirements for the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft. And so what we've been working on with the government team is first and foremost establishing a foundation of an all digital design, incorporating using model-based systems engineering, but incorporating, as Jeff mentioned, the modular open systems approach. So a lot of the design work that we've been doing with the government to date has resulted in more than 90% of our engineering being released and a significant amount of work going on across the industrial base related to building hardware to support that first, and not just the first prototype, but the first 6 or 8 prototypes that will be coming out of the program. But we'd look to complete that in early FY27, that first prototype.
Colonel, from the government side, what sorts of risks does that aggressive schedule potentially introduce for you, and what are some of the things that you're looking to do to manage that?
Yeah, I think initially when we were asked to accelerate, our concern was, okay, if we start working now while we're still in the middle of the design process, the chance is always there that we could end up building a prototype that doesn't do what we needed to do. The reason why we're okay with that and are willing to accept some of that risk is exactly for the reasons that Ryan mentioned. The V280 demonstrator gives us a lot of confidence in tilt rotor technology. We know Bell knows how to do it. The open system is something that they're fully on board with. And then the digital engineering and the digital environment provides the government a lot of insight into the design itself as it's occurring. Other things that we've agreed to do was allowed Bell to pursue some commercial best practices when it comes to safety of flight on some of the early prototypes and being able to leverage FAA certifications instead of Army airworthiness certifications, while in the background we'll continue to work Army airworthiness. So that is a little bit of an elevated risk, but one that the Army was willing to accept. Some of the digital engineering and technical deliverables, we've deferred the actual delivery of the items. However, what we've decided to do is really work together as an integrated team. So my team of 100 or so engineers very often are down there out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area working side by side along Bell engineers. So we have the insight of working along the way. Bell has the ability to ask questions and make adjustments, and they get feedback very quickly. As opposed to, maybe earlier it was about handing over technical deliverables for, very thorough reviews. So we've kind of accelerated our review process. Other things, the supply chain is always a concern, and the Secretary asked us to leverage the Defense Production Act. So we are engaged with the Army and soon to be the Department of War on how we can potentially get some elevated priority on our program when it comes to the Defense Production Act.
Yeah, and I do think that approach is working well. And I do appreciate when people ask us the question about risk associated with acceleration, because it gives us a chance to kind of walk through why I think we're in a uniquely favorable position to accelerate. And part of it we talked about was the demonstrator and going, 215 flight hours and all the data we were able to capture from that successful effort. But then also looking at the steps that we go through from early digital engineering and digital design, where we have fly-throughs leveraging virtual reality and augmented reality. We bring the maintainers into into that virtual environment and have them simulate maintenance of the aircraft very, very early in the design phase so that we don't have discoveries, 3, 5, 10 years later as we're trying to sustain the platform. A lot of that gets baked in early. And then from the standpoint of getting to first flight and flight test activity, we spent a lot of time trying to get discoveries as early as possible in the process. And how we do that is by doing a lot of component-based testing, whether it's fatigue testing, vibration testing, things of that nature at the component level. And then we integrate all of those components aside from the structure, but all the systems, a pilot in the loop, all the software in a weapon systems integration lab. And we have that facility down in Arlington, Texas, and the pilot will fly a fully integrated set of systems on the ground for months and months and months, proving out the software and proving out the integration of these components before we ever step foot in an aircraft. So we get a lot of opportunity to reduce risk and learn these lessons early in the program before we've started making even some of those accelerated LRIP aircraft.
Digital engineering's come up a few times in the conversation so far, and I'm wondering if either or both of you want to give some concrete examples of some of the work that you've been able to do in that virtual world and save time that way, vice things that in a previous era would have had to be done purely in a physical world.
Yeah, just to give a couple examples, and then I'll pass it to Jeff. But, I mentioned the maintainers and being able to have maintainers, in some cases, it's veterans that we've brought over from the services into Bell that have done this for their first career, and now they're spending their second career, so to speak, making sure we get it right. But they actually have virtual, I'll say, tools and toolboxes, and they work to maintain that aircraft. And they'll come to the engineering team after a test run and say, "Look, I had to remove 3 things to get to the part I was trying to fix," and it gives us an opportunity to fix that and make sure that if, number one, keep things from failing, but if something does fail, let's make sure it fails in a benign way and in a way that we can replace it and repair it in the field and as easily as possible. And the digital engineering, and I think Jeff will probably touch on this, it is an investment, and it's an investment early on that allows you to also take all these digital artifacts as kind of one source of truth and use them to support your tech pubs and your manuals. And again, that sustainment and logistics tail that the aircraft will have for decades to come. But it all goes back to that initial investment in digital engineering and that single source of truth. And I'll pass it to Jeff.
Yeah, we're really proud of the fact that this program was born digital. So we are clearly leading the way for defense acquisitions. We're a digital engineering pathfinder for the department. Like Ryan said, I think there's perhaps a misnomer out there that the investment in digital engineering somehow means that you get to go fast while you're designing. And I always say, look, this is an investment in time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we are designing faster. What it means is when we complete the design and then build it, you can actually test faster because there's a lot more that's right with the aircraft. You're a lot closer to what you wanted to get. The model-based systems engineering approach has allowed us and allowed Bell to really come up with a design that we're very confident won't miss any of the key requirements. In the past, it would be hard to know whether you were going to miss satisfying a requirement until you got to test. And then if it happened to be a big, expensive miss during test, then you're now iterating in the test environment. The goal was to really iterate in this digital and MBSE environment such that when you build the prototypes, you can have a test program that's half as long as a traditional aircraft test program that has occurred in the past. So that's really what we're getting at. MBSE and digital engineering go hand in hand. My engineers can go right to their computer and workstations and look at the design in real time. And that has never been able to be done before when you do things the old way.
On that requirements piece, I'd love to hear you both talk through a bit about the extent to which, if at all, requirements have needed to be changed in order to meet that go faster directive. And if the answer is no, tell us a bit about why not.
I'll take that one. Look, this aircraft is made up of hundreds and hundreds of requirements, and they're tiered into different buckets. None of the most important requirements, to include things that are deeply important to the Army, like MOSA, have had to be trade off. Might we have to trade some weight, take on a little bit of extra weight to include some provisions to ensure that the aircraft is truly modular and can handle the SOCOM variant and handle the medevac requirement? Might we have had to make those kinds of decisions? Absolutely. Are there certain things in the requirements document that are deep down in the requirement that might not be on the first aircraft? Yeah, probably. But that's not what we're seeking. We're not seeking perfection. The Secretary and the Chief made it very clear. We're not trying to get it absolutely perfect. What we need to do is deliver transformational capability. That's what we mean when we talk about, the speed and range twice as far, twice as fast, and the ability to handle the MOSA architecture and the open system. If we get that, we're going to have a very, very good first iteration of the aircraft. And by the same token, the open systems architecture will allow us to go in and upgrade anything that needs upgrading. When you go faster, you might have to trade off requirements. We haven't had any big decision event like that yet, but it is certainly something that we might have to think about in the future.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think we're very proud of where we're looking relative to the requirements for the platform and the capability it will provide the warfighter. And I'll just go back to, I'll say head start we had relative to tilt rotor technology being mature and giving us a good foundation to start with.
Last thing here, and I don't want to look too far down the road, but now's the time to start thinking about these things, obviously, and obviously you have been already thinking about sustainment. But specifically, what do things like that open systems architecture, having that engineering data, having all of that digital engineering data in hand, do for you down the road when you get to a sustainment phase on a platform like this?
I'll take this one initially. So sustainment is one of the things we've been thinking about very early on the program. When we went to our development decision, milestone B, I would say nearly half of the very extensive and rigorous documentation we had to submit to the Army and the Department of War was focused on the life cycle sustainment plan. So it's very much a key element of the program. I would say 1/4 of my office are logisticians that focus on things like training, on maintenance, and that kind of thing. Ryan mentioned the digital environment, being able to look at the design through virtual means with virtual headsets or augmented reality, that kind of thing. That has given us the ability to provide feedback so we get it right the first time. And then having access to certain data rights allows the Army to write training so that the training meets the Army's standards. It allows us to make decisions on what components we want to overhaul in the depot out there in Corpus Christi. Most importantly, I would say, is maintenance and ensuring that we have a good understanding about when parts will need to be replaced. I think all the work that Bell has done has allowed us to have a lot more insight into when components would need to be overhauled and replaced. Digital twins will be developed, so every tail number in the Army out there will have its own digital twin that will reside and can be accessed by my office, so that if there is a problem in the field, my logisticians and former maintainers will be able to look at that digital twin and have a really good snapshot of what's going on with the aircraft. And like Ryan said, it all comes down to having a single source of truth. In the past, documents would get shoveled over email, and then eventually, inevitably, someone would end up with an out-of-date or not the current version of what you're supposed to be looking at. This eliminates a lot of that churn, and I really see the sustainment of this aircraft is going to be a big part of why we call this aircraft affordable. As you know, sustainment, for the life cycle of a program, we consider about 70% of the cost of the life cycle of the program to be due to the sustainment phase. So it's very important to us that we reduce those sustainment costs. And kind of final point here, you typically can estimate the sustainment burden of an aircraft based on its weight. And while the MV-75 isn't especially light, it's on the heavier side when you compare it to heavier lift aircraft like Chinook. We have a much, we predicted through simulations and modeling that the sustainment is going to be much, much less than aircraft of its size and weight.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I would just say from an industry standpoint, programmatically, and I'll even say culturally, we've approached this clean sheet development in a different way that I think provides a lot more tools for the user, for the Army to maintain this long term. And some of the things that Jeff mentioned related to the correlation between weight and maintenance cost, or weight and cost in general. I'd like to think we're breaking some of those cost curves with this because of a lot of the tools that we've used, and quite frankly, because of some of the newer technologies that are available today that weren't available when some of the currently fielded aircraft were developed.
That's Federal News Network's Jared Serbu speaking with Colonel Jeffrey Poquette, Program Manager of the MV-75 FLRAA, and Bell's Ryan Ayinger, Senior Vice President and FLRAA Program Director. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Defense Logistics Agency may have solved two problems every agency tends to struggle with: attracting new and innovative companies and changing the culture of its workforce to work with those companies. DLA's Tech Accelerator team has shown over the last several years that it can use private sector methods to take an agile approach to solving problems using interviews, data, and market research. For more on the Tech Accelerator team, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller talked with David Koch, the Director of Research and Development at the Defense Logistics Agency.
We started the technology acceleration team about 6 years ago, and the whole idea was there's a lot of areas where there are commercial solutions that are available now. So they go out, they interview senior leaders. If there's a problem that needs to be solved, that we know that there's a quick commercial solution, and usually with non-traditional vendors, folks that don't usually do business with the government, then that's when we use that team. They've also done a ton of innovation training. We work with a company called BMMT, and we really are striving to bring up the innovation knowledge within the organization. So there's a lot of people with good ideas. They don't know how to bring it to fruition. And so we've been doing a lot of training with that team as well.
The team, I'm sure, has morphed and changed over the last 6 years. Where you thought you started or you're not today, how has that change happened? Like, what are some of the areas that you say, okay, we are different today than we were?
When we first started out, it was more about let's interview senior leaders, let's find a problem that we need to go solve. And now it's really growing into a life of its own, to where the program managers kind of reach out and say, hey, I need a commercial solution for the problem that I have. And so I think a lot of times now it's more internally focused, where we reach out to commercial solutions based on a problem that we know exists. I think because we become more aware of what's going on across the organization, we know where those problem areas are, where there's commercial opportunities.
I want to get back to the problem statement because you said something very interesting about that. But one of the things about the technology acceleration team that you mentioned was this idea of design thinking principles to foster innovation. Let's start with a brief definition of what that means, and then how are you using it?
So what that means is that we don't go into it with a solution in mind. We go into it solution agnostic. What is the problem that you want to solve? And then let's pull in a bunch of commercial folks that have tackled similar type problems, and we usually do that through an RFI that goes out to companies. We bring them in, and we see what kind of solutions they throw up. So we don't go into it with a preconceived idea of how to solve this problem.
Are you finding that you're starting to attract these, the DoD tends to call it non-traditionals, but some of these small emerging technology companies, or do you find that that's still a bigger hill to climb?
No, we attract a lot of them. And events like our Industry Collider Day really help facilitate that. I mean, over half the people that are here are small businesses just looking to get involved with the government. They've maybe never crossed that hurdle before, and they've heard through the grapevine, and the goal of the event is really teach them how to do work with us, and so I think that's been helpful.
One of the things you mentioned around the innovation training, around the technology acceleration team, is digital twin capabilities and bring them to warfighters. Can you talk a little bit about the R&D you're doing through that, maybe some of the projects?
Digital twin, and one of the companies was mentioned is a company by the name of RGBSI Aerospace. And what the whole idea is a digital twin could be a digital twin of a bunch of different things. A lot of times for us, it may start as a digital twin of a part, and so now that you have an electronic recreation model of what that part is, you also have something called the digital thread that you can pull with it. And that can pull in like acquisition data, logistics data, manufacturing data along with that thread, so that you can pull in more industry partners and more people are available to make that part. So yeah, we've done digital twins for parts. We've done them for processes. You can model a process. It used to be that you would go and use sticky notes and say, oh, this is how you do this. Now what we do is we use a computer program to go in and follow where the data flows, and it maps the process for you. Sometimes you're surprised when you find out how your process really works.
There seems to be a lot of excitement over digital twins? Are you seeing more requests coming in? Are you seeing more companies bringing you ideas using digital twins? What would you say? Are we still in the hype cycle? Are we past the hype cycle of digital twins? Are we still in the early phases?
I would say it's pretty mature. I mean, yes, we do have a lot of companies that want to come do that with us. We've really settled on a Celonis product for creating digital twins, especially digital twins of processes. Now, digital twins of parts is a little bit different, and there's no specific company that has the edge on that. But once you've created the twin, then we put it into our system, and it allows us to really work with industry.
I've seen, for instance, some reporting and some interviews around the Navy is big on digital twins. Are you seeing it across all of government, meaning a lot of your DoD and military services and defense agency partners are coming to you and looking to partner or looking to see what you've learned? Or is it really focused in one part of DoD for now, but you're seeing some growth?
So there's something called the Advanced Manufacturing Enterprise, and it's a subpanel of the Joint Defense Manufacturing Technology Panel, and they really dive into that kind of Industry 4 technology, 4.0 technology that you're talking about. So yes, definitely all the services are using digital twins. We're all kind of going the same direction. In fact, we have a roadmap working together because we communicate with them. If we all develop this independently, that's just expensive for the government. So we are all working together to try to do this smartly.
It is definitely one of those emerging / more mature technologies that's under the radar that folks maybe don't either understand or quite get how they could use it. And that actually is a great segue. You mentioned something earlier about design thinking, and one of the things you said was within the R&D office, you talk to senior leaders and commands and the J-codes and staff about, okay, what's your problem? Walk me through how that's been working to get them to shift their mindset from, hey, we need you to invest in X to, hey, we need you to solve problem Y.
If you start with, hey, I want to do a cool technology, sometimes you just miss the boat. And so we've really tried to work with our directors and senior leaders across the agency of what's the problem you want solved. Let us help you determine what the best technology is to get after that. And so when you start with problems, it really facilitates moving that direction.
Is that a big change for a lot of the folks within DLA to kind of think that way? Or once you kind of explained it and showed how it works, the culture shift happened fairly quickly?
I would say the culture shift has happened pretty well. I mean, our CIO really pushes us that direction because you can't just adopt a million new technologies. You've really got to go after what are the problems, here's some solutions, and you got to build off solutions that you're already working on. Otherwise, your IT gets way too expensive to maintain. So I would say it doesn't mean somebody doesn't come and say, hey, I want to do X because that sounds really cool. But for the most part, the leadership is really bought into let's solve problems and let's work at it from that direction.
One of those big problems was something called automating the inventory process. This has, I think, been a goal. I can go back to probably the 90s, early 2000s of using RFD guns and using all barcode technology. Where are you today with that project? Talk a little bit about that R&D effort.
There is a project called McPick that the Marine Corps implemented that really gets a kind of after automated inventory. We competed a bunch of products against each other. We're really happy with the backbone of their system, but it doesn't do everything that DLA needs it to do. So we're kind of merging that with a couple of other technologies to really give the whole spectrum. Because DLA, you think about it, with 25 different distribution centers, we have a lot of stuff that's outside. Think big strikers and tanks and stuff like that are just out there in the open. So you need something like a drone that's going to go around and capture that inventory. And then you have a lot of small things, think firearms and stuff like that we have to do inventory. So that's the backbone that we're building it upon. The idea is, you walk down the aisle and your inventory populates on your laptop or your iPad, and we think we can get there.
Where are you at with this effort? Is it still in the early stages? Are you looking at strategies like RFIs and potential OTAs and all those fun things, or are you more mature?
We're a little bit more mature. I mean, we've already kind of finished, the exploration. We've narrowed it down from a bunch of companies to just a few that we're putting together to create a comprehensive solution. And now we're really building it out at one of our distribution centers in Anniston because they have a lot of outdoor stuff. They also have small stuff and stuff in warehouses. So it's a good opportunity to check the various types of parts that are out there that we need inventory.
Is this considered the kind of the beta, the pilot, and then you'll see kind of how it goes and grow it from there?
It's definitely a pilot. I mean, we will grow it from there, but it's not too late to change directions if it doesn't work out.
David Koch is the Director of Research and Development at the Defense Logistics Agency, speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. You can find Jason's full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Standiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.